part 5. So we're not quite finished covering c5 yet. So there's one more variation we have to look at, which is this Curies-Parma variation, which is what happens when black plays 3e6 and then 4d5. Okay. So we are going to capture this pawn. And now black actually usually recaptures with this knight. So if he recaptures with a pawn, it becomes actually a variation known as the Tarrasch defense after d4. So it kind of transposes from a d4 opening. But this is usually fairly uncommon. But just to give you an idea of what you should expect if black does take here after d4. So the main line goes something like knight c6, castle, bishop e7, and now knight c3 is a main line. But here also possible simply to take. So notice that we force this bishop to move to e7 and then we take, so we kind of gain a half a tempo in that way. Bishop takes, and now notice black has an isolated pawn. So Tarrasch was very fond of having the isolated pawn in these positions, but okay. So bishop g5 to pin this knight. Now black has a couple moves here. Black castles, then queen c2, bishop e6, knight c3. If d4, then knight e4. This is strong, so this pawn needs to stay on d5. So bishop e6 to defend this pawn. Put more pressure on it. And here white's doing pretty decently. Notice that if black plays rook e8 here, then an interesting try would be a move like knight e4, trying to take advantage of this pin. What was strong about knight e4? On move 11. Okay, so if d4, knight e4, we'll notice that now black's pawn structure is guaranteed to be ruined because there's no way for black to defend this knight. So if black has to recapture this with a pawn, it's pretty much black's chances are ruined because he gets a pawn here, a pawn here, a pawn here, and a pawn here. So he has 4 isolated pawns. And so similarly, like I was showing you in that other variation, after knight e4, you're taking advantage of some pins to do the same thing. And then if a move like d4 again, of course, knight e4, same idea. So that's why black has to break the pin as soon as possible. But then after bishop f4, white has a comfortable position. And the other thing black can try is if he wants to play immediately bishop e7 to break the pin. It makes more sense than to bring it back to b6 because the bishop's not doing too much on this diagonal. So knight c3, h6. So black often tries to chase this bishop away as soon as possible. Bishop f4 again. So we don't want to take this knight unless it's going to lead to some doubling of pawns. Otherwise we're just giving up the 2 bishops for nothing. Bishop e6. So again we move it rook a d1. So it might look a little weird to play rook a d1 as opposed to rook fd1 because we might want to put this rook on c1, but it turns out that this is actually better because this rook often wants to go to e1 because we might be playing e4 at some point. So rook a d1, rook c8, queen a4 to get out of potential problems on the c file, knight a5 and knight e5, and white should be better. Okay, and then one more thing, and again this is not usually what you'll see in this variation, but just in case it does transpose to the Tarrasch, if black plays bishop e6, then again similar stuff. Queen a4, castle, and here again rook a d1. So notice that the moves are pretty much the same in pretty much every variation. Okay, and now here we're going to take because it leads to the win of a pawn temporarily. After knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, Rook takes d5, black can win his pawn back. But after rook b5, queen takes e2, rook takes b7, white's doing quite well here. Because this bishop is a monster. This knight's going to have to do something, and we're double attacking this pawn. So black's in some trouble here. Limited material, but if white can have an extra a pawn, it should be a good advantage. Because notice the bishop controls the queening square, so it's going to be hard for black to stop that pawn. Okay, so now let's go back to the main line, which is knight takes d5. Okay, so castle, knight c6, and knight c3. And a common mistake black players may make here is to try to kind of develop a Maroczy bind. This is Chess Position Trainer 4.1.1. You can download it for free if you'd like, and do the same thing I do. The nice thing about it is it saves everything. So for example, you see this position. If I just go back and start from move 1, I can go back and get to that same position just by clicking these moves. So if I click knight f6, bishop g2, e6, knight f3, d5, cd5, knight d5, castle, knight c6, knight c3, I get back to this position. It's nice, it saves everything, and it also gives you options to train on these positions. So once you input all these positions into it, you can ask it to train you, and then I'll show the positions again. And I'll ask you what the best move is, and then it helps you learn the opening. But okay, so just a quick note that if black tries to establish some sort of Maroczy bind by playing e5, this actually loses a pawn to a familiar tactic, knight takes e5. So notice that we're uncovering double attack on this d5 square. So if black takes on e5, we take on d5. If he takes on c3, we take on c6, take on d1, take on d8. And again, we'll be up a pawn at the end of this. Desperado's aplenty, but it works out for white. So e5 is a mistake. So we're going to play the main move here, which is to play bishop e7. We'll move this line up because it's the main line. So you see, notice how the main line is with a dark, or rather a thicker arrow. It's actually lighter, but it's thicker, and then the side moves are with a smaller, darker arrow. Okay, so bishop e7. And now we choose to take on d5. So black would be wise to take with the pawn. If he takes with the queen, it could get prematurely exposed. Notice that this bishop is now on this diagonal. So there's nothing we can do to take immediate advantage of it, but simply a move like d3. Then castle, bishop e3. So now we're threatening maybe a knight d4 idea. So queen d6, and now d4. C takes d4, knight takes d4. And white's bishops are kind of pointed at the queen side, and this bishop is going to have a hard time getting out, so white should be a bit better here. Okay, so we're going to look at e takes d5. And now we're pretty much going to have to play this move d4 eventually. We were kind of trying to delay it as long as possible, but at this point, I mean, there's really nothing else we can do to improve our position because we need to get this bishop out. So d4. Then castle. And d takes c5, bishop takes c5. So notice that this looks very similar to the Tarrasch lines we were looking at before. The only difference is that this knight and this knight have been exchanged. So this should actually probably be slightly better for white than the position with the knights on, because you know, as you get closer to an endgame, this pawn becomes more of an issue. Isolated pawns don't like endgames. They prefer middle games because this pawn kind of controls, you know, c4 and e4 and gives black some good piece play. But as it gets closer to an endgame, that pawn will become a liability. Okay, so this is basically like the starting position for this line, assuming that black plays knight takes d5 on move 5 rather than e takes d5. So here we want to develop with tempo with bishop g5. Okay. So now black has a few choices here, actually. So black can either challenge the bishop immediately. He can play a move like queen to b6. He can just bring his bishop back. Or he can move his queen to d7. So we'll look at f6 first. So black's trying to say, okay, well, if you want to gain a tempo to attack my queen, I'm going to gain a tempo to attack your bishop. But the problem with this move is it weakens this diagonal, this a2, g8 diagonal, which doesn't look like it will be an issue, but it turns out that white can do stuff to kind of make this move seem a bit silly. Yeah, queen b6 is definitely the best option, but just want to show you guys what happens if black chooses something that's a bit inferior. Okay, so this bishop wants to go back to d2. Now, logical move bishop f5, trying to play the bishop to e4 and kind of stop white from attacking his pawn. Queen b3, bishop b6, bishop e3. And now, of course, black would love to play this move d4, but what's the problem with d4? Well, it's illegal. And so this move f6 is kind of costing black a bit. So black tries knight a5, and then queen c3, take, rook e8, queen c5. Okay, so a little cute trick. So black plays b6 here, but what happens if rook takes e2 here? So this move loses. It's a little two-move combination. So the first move would be to attack black's undefended pieces. So there's a nice way we can do that with this move, knight to d4. So now we're attacking the rook and the bishop. But black actually has a defense. Black can defend both pieces by moving the rook and defending the bishop. But then we can attack the rook again and force it to move, and we can do this by the move f4. And so black would have to resign here because he's losing a piece. Once the rook moves, we just take the free bishop. So rook takes e2 is a little trap that doesn't quite work. So again, b6 is correct. And now after queen b5, now notice our queen is defending this pawn. So a6, queen a4, and again, this pawn is defended by this knight d4 idea. So b5, queen f4, bishop b4, and rook a c1. And then after knight c4, b3, knight e5, and knight d4. White's plan is going to be to infiltrate along this c-file, and this knight is well posted on d4 because, again, the best square for a knight is in front of an isolated pawn. So this knight will never be able to be chased away, and white can prepare doubling on the c-file with combining pressure on this d-pawn. So white is better here. With the queen on a4, black pin the knight. Okay, so you're saying why can't rook takes e2 now? Well, notice on knight d4 what's happening. The bishop protects the square that the rook could pin on, right? So always be careful about looking where all the pieces are. Yeah. Okay, so now let's look at the better move, which is Daru suggested, is queen b6. Okay. So this is better, but it also has a bit of a drawback, which is that this bishop often likes to retreat to this square, and now the queen is depriving it of that option. So it looks natural for us to maybe take this pawn on d5, but actually black is fine here, because he can develop this bishop with tempo, and our queen gets chased around a bit. Not to mention that his queen's attacking our pawn. So queen takes d5 is not a move that will lead to much of an advantage at all, if any. So superior is to just develop the rook to c1, immediately target this bishop. So now queen takes b2 obviously just loses a piece. So d4, queen c2, bishop d6, knight d2, good move, targeting these squares c4 and e4, bishop e6, now knight e4, now this bishop is suddenly running short of squares, so it retreats, and then after capture, knight g5 to harass this bishop now, and now queen c5. So notice this bishop is eyeing this pawn on b7, we're attacking this knight, we're also attacking this bishop, so the knight can't really move. So black defends the knight, and white plays b4, and here white should be better. Again, control the c-file. a target on b7, this d4 pawn is still a bit shaky. Okay, so let's look at bishop e7, just trying to solve the problem immediately. But this exchange should actually be good for white, because notice that this bishop was helping to control this square in front of the pawn. So it's all about controlling this square in front of the pawn. And so a dark square bishop trade should actually help white in terms of blockading this pawn and getting his pieces onto the correct square. So black offering his trade should be a bit of a blessing for white. So we should take and then just get our rooks connected. Move like e3. Notice again, stopping d4 ideas. We want to make sure this square is firmly under our control. Then after rook ac1, basically only white can be better here. Again, our pieces are perfectly fine. Black has this structural weakness on d5. We have the c file that we can play on. So white should be okay here. Okay, and we'll look at the last one, which is queen d7. And so the point is that he wants to move the queen without having any of the drawbacks of queen b6. Unfortunately, he does block in this bishop, but he reasons that once he plays this move h6 and chases this bishop away, he'll have time for queen e7, which is really where he wants his queen to begin with. And the tempo lost will be regained. Okay. So now a standard maneuver in this position is to blockade this pawn. But unfortunately, we don't really have the d4 square under our control. So we want to blockade it on d3, a square we do have under control, so knight e1. The name of the program is Chess Position Trainer 4.1.1. Okay, so now notice the knight is coming to d3 and potentially to f4. And from f4 we can actually attack this pawn. But on d3 it sits nicely. And also notice it opens up the bishop as well. So don't be afraid to reroute your knight if it can find a happier home. So black immediately plays d4 to try to take advantage of the fact that he can play it. If black plays h6 first, for example, then after bishop f4, rook d8, blockade, and rook c1, white is better. So let's go back to what happens after d4. So knight d3. And now reroute this bishop. Okay, now notice white plays rook fe1 here. So the idea is he might anticipate the opening of this file. So like if black plays d3, for example, he wants his rook on the e file. And here white should be slightly better. Again, this knight can always come to d3 to forestall this pawn from advancing. And the bishop on g2 is doing pretty good work. Okay, so that's the Keres-Parma variation. So now we're going to look at what happens when black plays neither c5 nor e5, but knight f6. Okay, so this will actually transpose a fair amount of the time. So again, we're going to play g3 on move 2. Okay, so usually in this position, black will play e5. And notice that this transposes to something we've already covered, as is noted by this fact that the bishop g2 is highlighted. So that means we already covered it. And this is actually the most common response. Other moves that are possible are, say, g6, which again will transpose most likely after, say, bishop g2, bishop g7, knight c3, d6, e4, castle, and then knight g2. So this would probably transpose into the Botvinnik system after, say, c5. Then maybe castle. Okay. So, and then also after knight f6, g3, another transpositional idea is e6. And then of course after bishop g2, like say c5, knight f3, and then this transposes to something we already saw. Okay, but we're going to look at something that is its own unique thing, and that is this pseudo-Grunfeld idea with d5. So after c5, knight d5, bishop g2, g6, knight c3. Okay. So if white had a pawn on d4, black had bishop on g7, this would actually be a Grunfeld. But since our pawn hasn't moved yet, we actually have some more options. So black has two moves here. One is to play knight takes c3, and one is to play knight b6. So let's look at knight takes c3 first. Okay, so we're going to take back up the b pawn. Okay. Bishop g7. And now we play rook b1. The idea, of course, is that we want to play the move rook takes b7. Looks awkward, but if we play bishop takes b7, then notice after bishop takes and rook takes, black has queen d5, which forks the rook on b7 and the rook on h1. So the actual way that that white wins a pawn here, or threatens to win a pawn here, is actually to play rook takes b7. Because after bishop takes and bishop takes, notice the rook is trapped. So after the knight moves, bishop takes rook, queen takes, black loses a pawn. So there's a couple of ways black can defend against this. Knight d7 is usually most common. You also try c6, and then knight f3, castle, castle, b6. Notice how we delay d4, and oftentimes don't even play it. c4, bishop b7, bishop b2, c5. And a4. So the idea is that white will eventually play this move a5, and black will either have to take this pawn, in which case these three pawns will all be weak, or he'll have to allow pawn takes pawn, after which pawn takes pawn, then the b pawn becomes weak, or if he takes with the knight, then the a pawn and the c pawn become weak. So regardless, white's going to be able to inflict weakness on the black queen side, and white's kingside pawns are all very nice and compact. So it looks like this pawn's a little weird, but because we're able to play a5 by force, we ensure that we have a structural advantage long term. Can white play c5 before black? In this position, after bishop b7, c5? Yeah, you can, but you're not actually threatening anything. And playing pawn takes pawn just helps black, right? So say you play c5 here, I played, knight d7 or something, and now you have to take. And now what happened? All of a sudden, you have a big weakness, and my pawns are fine. So be careful about using the c pawn rather than the a pawn. Yeah, black doesn't have to take. It's not checkers. Captures are not obligatory. Okay. So in any case, after bishop b2, c5. So let me show you a couple more moves to kind of illustrate why this is okay for white. Okay, so queen c7, and now a5 immediately. Okay, so black takes this pawn, but obviously he's never going to be able to hold on to it. He's going to keep pushing the pawn. But here after rook a5, rook c7, and rook bb5. Now the knight is simply going to play either knight b2 or c3, knight takes a4, and this a pawn will fall eventually. Okay, so instead we'll look at knight d7. Okay, so you might think, well, how does this defend the pawn? Can't I just take it now? Because now there's no queen d5. Well, you can take it, but the problem is, after take and take, what does black play here? So unfortunately this rook is a bit far afield. And after knight b6. Oops. Okay, this rook is trapped. So this is something you want to avoid as white. You don't want to get your rook trapped. So bishop takes b7 is not what we should do. But we should just develop. So knight f3, castle, castle, and knight to b6. Okay, so this is the basic position. So the idea is black played knight d7 to play knight b6 to kind of control these a4 and c4 squares, so that the rook, and also block the rook's access to the b file. Okay, so now white has a strong move at his disposal. Let's move knight to g5. Again, notice that we're not developing this pawn. We're not playing d4 or anything, because again, that would be more of a typical Grunfeld idea. But by delaying the movement of this pawn, we kind of keep our structure very nice and compact. And now the idea with knight g5 is that we actually want to transfer this knight to the square c5 and put great pressure on the queen side. So with this knight on c5, notice we're attacking this pawn twice, and it'll actually be very hard for black to finish his development. So queen d7, queen b3. So the idea is if knight e4, black can play rook d8. But queen b3, so now rook d8 is impossible. Queen g4, back to f3, bishop b6, queen c2. And now white's lost a couple of tempi, but he's going to gain them back with moves like rook b4 and then knight d4. So black tries to activate his queen, but again knight g5. So white's not worried about this queen takes pawn because rook b2, queen a6, take, and queen e4 is almost curtains for black. I mean, this pawn's hanging, this pawn's hanging. His pawns are terrible. White has two bishops. This knight's kind of just chilling on b6. So this would be very good for white. So instead, black plays a move like bishop g4 to avoid a trade on e6. But then, of course, we can take on b7. Okay, b8 to defend the rook, and now bishop f3 to defend this pawn. And after bishop takes f3, we play e takes. If we play knight takes, then black could take on e2, but we play e takes. Then h6, knight h3, knight d5, rook b3. And then after f5, bishop a3, rook fd8, and rook e1. And here white's up a pawn, and the black pawn on e7 is not particularly happy, and neither are the black pawns on a7 or c7. So white should feel comfortable here. This knight is a bit out of play, but black can't really take advantage of it. And if this knight on d5 ever moves, white will play knight f4 as soon as possible. So white should be good here. Black's other choice in this position. Yeah, but he doesn't even need to. Because I mean, really, this knight on d5 looks powerful, but it's not actually doing anything. So as long as that knight sits on d5, we'll just chill. We won't bother doing anything. And then if the knight ever moves, like I said, we'll play knight f4. But there's no need to reroute the knight, because we're busy doing other things, like getting our rook active, potentially playing a move like d3 and c4 to kick the knight away, stuff like that. So okay, so now let's look at black's other alternative, which is to play knight b6 on move 5. Okay, so now d3, bishop g7, and bishop e3. So the idea of this move, bishop e3, is that we just want to quickly try to exchange our bishops. So we're going to try to play queen d2, bishop h6, and affect the typical dark square exchange. So castle, queen d2, and here rook e8. So the idea now for black is after bishop h6, black will actually play bishop h8 and try to preserve his bishop. But okay, bishop h6, bishop h8. And now, since we haven't castled yet, we have already made kingside attack with h4. Black plays c6, h5, knight d5. So the idea is that black wants to generate some counterplay along this diagonal by hitting this knight a second time. Simply knight f3, knight d7, knight e4, queen b6, and now we castle to defend this pawn. And now black plays knight c5, not anticipating what'll follow. Do you guys see maybe what'll follow? This is some heady stuff. Do you guys anticipate what's going to happen here? Well, this is something I should be familiar with. Okay, so take and take. Okay, so take was forced. If you take, like, say, knight takes c4, I can take on h7 first, and that's disastrous. So you have to take back. You have to take back. Okay, now, do you guys see what white should do here? Well, white has this very nice move, bishop f8. Bishop to f8. And the idea is it just is a line clearance for the h file. So if king takes bishop, he just made it in 2 moves. Rook takes h8 and queen h6 mate. If rook takes, he's made it in 8 moves. If rook takes, queen h6 and rook h1. So he can't actually take the bishop. So do you guys see why he can't take what the rooks say? Because of check, check, and rook h1. And now queen h7 and queen h8 are both threatened. And so black has just a couple of checks. Like he can play like knight takes d3 check, queen takes b2 check, but can't really stop the mate. So he can't take the bishop. So black tries bishop takes b2, queen takes b2, queen takes b2, king takes b2, knight a4 check, don't forget. So king a3 and f5. So materially, white's only down up. Actually, white's down a pawn here, right? Oh no, sorry, he's up a piece. Sorry, he's up a piece because black sacrificed. Sorry, he's up a piece for a pawn. So white's up a piece right now. So he plays knight e5, knight ac3. So notice that black can't take the bishop with the king because of rook h8, which wins the rook. And if black takes it with the rook, then probably a move like knight e5 is very strong, hitting g6. So he still can't actually take the bishop. So he plays knight c3, trying to attack the rook and defend his knights. Actually, his knight's hanging too. I forgot. Sorry, his knight's hanging. That's a bigger point. Yeah, so his knight's on a4 is hanging. So if he takes the bishop, I just take the knight. Sorry. So he plays knight c3. And then yes, you do have the fork, but 2 pieces are better than a rook. So this actually transposes to the same thing, basically, because after bishop h6, knight d1, rook d1, again, 2 pieces for rook, and black's pawns are kind of all a bit weird. So this should be very good for white. Even stronger, by the way, than bishop h6 may have been a move like rook h6. So for example, if knight takes d1, then there's a very cute rook takes g6, king takes f8, knight h7 check, king f7, and knight e5 mate. So that would have been a cute way to end the game. But it's not what happened. So that's the pseudo Grunfeld. So I'll cover one more quick thing, which is the g6 line. So like I was saying before, these are usually transpositional, but okay. So after g3, bishop g7, bishop g2. So assuming it won't be a total transposition, there are 2 other moves. So c5 transposes and stuff we've seen before. So he can try e5 or knight f6. So if e5, knight c3, d6, e4, knight f6. And here actually the move is knight ge2, but it'll transpose eventually. Oops, so castle. Castle, castle. And now, okay, say for example he plays knight c6 here, then after f4 this transposes to a line we've seen, as the arrows indicate. So a try that's kind of its own thing would be c6. I'll show you what happens. Say black plays c5 and tries to copy white's pawn structure. So the point here is, the reason that this is advantageous for white is because white can play f4 in one move. White can play f4 in one move, whereas it's going to take black at least a couple moves to get in the similar f5. So by playing a quick f4, white can usually gain an advantage. So for example, d3, knight c6, h3, knight d4, and now knight d4. So cd4 is probably better. If ed4, well, I'll do cd4 first, but if ed4, the point is that on knight e2, knight e8, we have a strong idea of b4. So if we can capture this pawn on c5 with our pawn, then this pawn will be a monster after f4 and e5. And also we can just get this pawn rolling with f4 and g5 as well, because there'll be no pawn here. And if c takes b4, then after a3, b takes a3, rook takes a3, knight c7, bishop e2, knight e6, and queen a1. So notice that this pawn is actually going to be lost. And white has a superior structure because this pawn on d6 is a problem. So that's a nice little trick to know. Okay, c takes e4 is probably better. But now knight a4, and now white can either play b4 or f4. And here white should be better. Okay, if knight bd7, for example, again f4 should be good, because we can get an f5 and just get a kingside attack going. So now let's look for c6. So of course you can transpose into a King's Indian fianchetto if you play d4. So this will just be like a main line in the King's Indian defense where you play g3 and bishop g2. But if you want to stay in purely English channels, you play d3. Then knight a6, h3 to stop bishop g4, knight c7, and f4. And now you can't respond with f5. So the idea, again, is white's going to play f5, g4, g5, and just storm the king side. So black's going to stage some counterattack, but just take a3 to stop b4. Bishop e3 is okay. f5 is also attractive. So if f5, d5, for example, then simply g4. But bishop e3 is perfectly okay too. And then queen e7, rook c1, rook fb8. Now queen e1, b4, and queen f2. And white should be better here. Now let's take a look at the final line, which is what happens if black plays knight f6 on move 3. So knight f6, knight c3. If d6 again, this is going to transpose for sure. So castle. And again, if you want to play King's Indian, you can play d4 here. But if you want to keep in English channels, again, d3. So d6. And now bishop g5. So it's a little different than what we're used to. But the idea is simply just play queen d2 and bishop h6 and exchange the bishops off. But also, the goal is to not play e4 until it's immediately clear how black wants to play. If he wants to play c5 or e5, or he just wants to play like c6. So until black commits to the center, we're not going to commit to the center completely. So it's kind of like a high-class waiting move in a way. So if h6, we simply retreat the bishop to d2. We don't want to retreat to f4 or e3 because it can get further targeted by black, like e5 with tempo or something. So if e5, we can play e4 and play a Botvinnik style position. So if c6, again e4. Now that black's played c6, we can commit to e4. Knight g2. Now e5 will reach a similar position to what we've seen before after h3. a6, castle, b5, bishop e3, rook b8, cb5, ab5, b4, stopping some queenside play, a4. So white decides to play on the queen side here, but queen d2 would have been perfectly fine with the idea of f4 again. So ba4, rook a4, d5. And now this move weakens the c5 square. Bishop a7 and rook a5. So the point is he wants to play knight a4 to c5. Now d4, knight a4, knight e8, queen d2. Now finally this knight comes into the c5 square. So now obviously if rook takes, pawn takes, queen takes, this knight on d6 hangs at the end. And there's a pin here, so he unpins the knight. And after f4, knight b5, queen a2. And now actually white has pressure on the king side because potentially can attack this f7 pawn. And he also has pressure on the queen side with this open a file. And yeah, that's what happens if black plays a g6 line that's not a transposition. So that's part 5. And then I think that the final part, part 6, will basically just be other moves that black can play on move 1.